So it's now February. The road to freedom is supposedly going to be outlined on the 22nd of February, but is the end of lockdown really in sight? It looks like it could be many months away still. Aberdeenshire records the lowest temperature in the UK since 1995, a rather bracing minus 22.9 degrees centigrade. And the Duke and Duchess of Sussex announced they will no longer be working members of the royal family. A nation mourns. High point of the month, well, I guess you could say that's the pathway to freedom is announced. Low point of the month, well, the pace of that pathway to freedom. Even if all of the gateways are got through, it's going to be June until we actually get our freedoms back. And of course, February was the month in which Southampton lost 9-0 away to Manchester United, but we'll gloss over that one. Bants of the month, that's an easy one. Angela Rayner accuses the IEA's Kristian Niemietz of, quote, disgracefully attacking the NHS and NHS staff. So to discuss the month of February, two members of the home team join me. Our head of lifestyle economics, Chris Snowdon. Chris, good to have you back. Merry Christmas to you. And our IEA head of political economy, Dr. Kristian Niemietz. Kristian, how the devil are you, sir?
I can't complain. How are you?
I can always complain. I can always complain. Are you doing well, Chris?
Not so bad.
Looking forward to Christmas, I hope.
Yeah.
Chris, I'm going to start with you, the roadmap. So this was, just to remind people, a 4-step plan, originally supposed to finish in June, did end up running well onto July, based on, crucially, data, not dates, but that seemed to come into question pretty early doors. And delays to it were estimated ultimately to cost about £1 billion a week. Was the roadmap ever about data and not dates?
No, not really, because they specified the dates, you know. So it was a one-way ratchet. If the data was really good, which to be fair it wasn't, and unfortunately Delta really interfered with the whole process, it didn't matter how good the data was, the dates were never going to be moved forwards. And it seemed to me in February, and as I say, Delta kind of changed this massively, but it seemed to me in February that this was too long, you know, and it started off being we're going to vaccinate the over 70s and the vulnerable, then it went to the over 50s, then it went to the over 30s, and now it's like the over 5s, you know, for some people. Was it right in retrospect? Possibly it wasn't that far off, to be honest. I don't think we need to extend it in June, but realistically, if you look at the rising cases, it started in May. You know, once the pubs are open indoors, which has always been my definition of lockdown ending, then
that's all you care about in life, isn't it?
And the difference between the June restrictions and July restrictions really weren't that enormous. So I think had we been dealing with Alpha, we would have been able to suppress it from certainly May onwards, and we wouldn't have needed to continue into June, let alone July. But Delta did get in the way, obviously much more transmissible. So I think in retrospect, it wasn't actually that far off, probably. And we're in pretty good position now as a result of it.
Kristian, what was your take on it? Is that the right way to sort of look at a kind of pandemic problem? They set up these sort of 3 gates. As Chris says, you couldn't accelerate towards those gates. You would only pass through it on the day in question. That's the day at which the data would be looked at. If the data was good earlier, too bad. But if it was good on that day, you pass through the gate, then you've got a next gate to get to. Is that the right way of managing it? Because for all Chris says about, well, you can just be guided by the data, I guess the economy needs some certainty as well, right? You don't want, if you're a pub landlord, the only thing that Chris cares about, if you're a pub landlord, you don't want to know, well, am I opening on Monday or not? You know, you want to know a pretty definite yes, no. You want to have those sort of staging posts and that certainty, even if it's slow. Is that fair defence of the government's approach?
I think it is, and it may not have been the most brilliant plan ever, but nonetheless, at the time, it was a game changer. I had that paper that you mentioned coming out in that month. I think in the paper, towards the end, I'm saying there is still no end in sight. We don't know how this will ever end. And just a couple of weeks later, this roadmap changed that, and it was one of the first of its kind. And it was, I remember there was a headline in the German press at the time. They looked at this and said, "Dear Brits, we envy you." Because there was a definite date for things like the pubs opening up, the beer gardens first, and this was admired.
And it was irreversible as well. That's the point you didn't make. A lot of people have forgotten about that now, because I think
once you've gone through gate 1, they weren't going to pull you back the other way.
The whole thing was meant to be irreversible.
Yeah, that was the concept. What do you think about that certainty point, Chris? That even if slow, and let's say Delta hadn't arrived, you could potentially say we could have got through it quicker. But if you're running a business, a hospitality sector, something like that, you presumably want certain markers in the sand, right? You want to know, actually, there's no prospect of me opening for 3 weeks, rather than suddenly being told at a press conference on a Friday evening that you can open the next day.
Yeah, businesses tend to like certainty almost more than anything else.
Yeah, even if
a
it's
lot
bad
of the time.
news, that you know what you're dealing with.
Yeah, and when they did push it back into July, I don't think it was. It was. I think they gave quite a good bit of notice, didn't they? You know, I mean, it was bad news, and I didn't agree with it at the time. I still think it's probably the wrong decision. But as long as you got certainty, you know where you are. But again, nightclubs aside, and a couple of other kind of things. By that time, remember, we were in like the Euros by then. The entire football stadiums were full of people by that stage.
Not quite full, I think.
Oh, were they not?
Right. Yeah, not quite full. Yeah,
But look,
that was
pretty busy.
That's a problem that led to the final. People knew there were 12,000 empty seats.
Oh, really?
That's, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Not quite full, but you're right. We were sort of getting there. Now, Kristian, I want to move on to the paper that you released for under the IEA banner that month. We'll make sure that we link to that in the show notes below, so you can find Kristian's paper there. It was called Viral Myths, and essentially your analysis was too early to tell, a bit like the Chinese comment on the French Revolution, right? That we couldn't. Have I got that right? It was too early for people, and people were racing already to draw conclusions that the pandemic and the response to it had proved their ideological stance beyond belief. And your argument was these are actually myths. A long, long way to go before the data's in and we can learn any lessons.
Yes, and I think even when we have full data, it's never going to be of the kind that we will be able to say this economic model is more pandemic proof than that economic model, or this healthcare system is better than that one. The idea that a pandemic would somehow tell us what the right level of public spending should be, what the right level of healthcare spending should be, that was always a nonsense, but that was what was happening at the time. You could see this right across the press, that people were using this pandemic as a way of peddling the causes they were already peddling. Everyone somehow saw it as a confirmation of what they already believed, including people with mutually exclusive worldviews. You had Brexiteers and Remainers. The Brexiteers saying, this proves that Brexit was the right thing to do, and Remainers saying, well, this proves that Brexit was a total disaster and we should have stayed in. And you had that going on across the board. And I think you, Chris, had a Twitter thread about this from the first lockdown, I think. Yeah. And what happened in the meantime was that some of those confirmation bias stories had become conventional wisdoms. The idea that this shows that the British state is too small, for example, or that it shows that the economy is too open and that we need economic nationalism, or of course the idea that the NHS is somehow a star performer. And these are the things that I wanted to address. And
you had the temerity, Kristian, to suggest that you couldn't really say that the NHS had been the best performer. Perhaps we should query that. And this riled the usually unflappable Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, thereby making your paper into a media sensation. What did you actually say about the NHS? It seemed to me to be incredibly mild-mannered, but not mild-mannered enough for Angela Rayner's taste.
No, and I think it couldn't have been. I didn't say very much about the NHS. It wasn't mainly about healthcare, the paper. That was maybe a third of it. What I said was that it is, of course, true that you can't judge healthcare systems for the pandemic performance of a country, because that's not primarily a function of the healthcare system. That's more a matter of the overall pandemic response. Mm-hmm. And if a government has a pandemic strategy that is not working, that is flawed, as ours clearly was.
It's nothing special. I think
yes, nothing special.
It's nothing special, not now and not ever.
I don't remember the last bit, but yes, I did say nothing special, and it was nothing special. I stand by that. I did say we shouldn't this isn't primarily a function of the healthcare system, but there were some systems that were facing very similar challenges, where the infection numbers were very similar relative to population size. In the Netherlands, for example, infection rates were almost identical to ours, and yet they had far fewer deaths, and they didn't have to shut down most of the conventional healthcare system. And compared to those peers, the NHS was really not doing brilliantly.
Okay, now some months later, Kristian, you can be honest with us, when you put in those 3 words, it's nothing special. Was that deliberately done to trigger Angela Rayner?
I knew that it would trigger someone. I didn't know that it was going to be Angela Rayner, but I'll take that.
Right.
Good as any.
Chris, what do you think we can say? I mean, obviously, Kristian's paper came out in February. We've got a lot more data since. What do you think do you think we can now begin to pull things together to compare different healthcare systems, or at least different response systems? As Kristian rightly says, you might have an unbelievably crappy healthcare system, but a brilliant pandemic response unit or brilliant ways of stopping transmission, or vice versa, a brilliant healthcare system, but general control of the pandemic is so appallingly bad that the healthcare system gets overrun anyway. How do we kind of try and split the wheat from the chaff in order to learn some lessons here about who's performed well? Is there anything to see? Is there any signal, or is it all noise?
I think nearly every country has ballsed it up in a different way, actually. There's very few countries you can point to and say they've done a really good job. And every time somebody does do that, then suddenly they have a massive wave, you know. And you get this from the zero COVID people. That we should follow Germany. Suddenly Germany just goes off the charts in terms of its infections. Or we should follow South Korea, and suddenly South Korea has a big outbreak. Even Japan, which seemed to be doing really well, had a big outbreak. So there's very few countries, apart from maybe Taiwan, and even now I've said that, they'll probably have a huge epidemic. Very few. I mean, Australia and New Zealand, in a way, look pretty good from a purely health perspective, but then they mucked up on the vaccine delivery. We messed up on the initial response, I would say, and then kind of pulled it back a bit with the
But that's okay, isn't it? We can pick and mix. I wasn't suggesting that the data would be so easy that we could all just say, we should all be like South Korea. Everything they did was marvellous. But you might be able to say, I don't know, for example, that the UK didn't have good systems to get PPE to hospitals. That was very slow.
Sure, yeah.
But we did have a good system for rolling out the vaccine quickly. Yeah. That's fine. Could we pick and mix and say a bit of British this, a bit of South Korean that, a bit of Dutch the other, a bit of Swiss something else, and that would have been the perfect recipe?
Up to a point, but the only reason you do that is to prepare for the next pandemic, right? And the next pandemic won't necessarily happen in the same way. So a lot of what we think about the success of different approaches, you know, with hindsight, it looks like we should have locked down much earlier and probably stayed locked down for longer. And the New Zealand model, in that respect, even if you ignore the fact that they were very slow with the vaccination, that was a good response. But that's only because the vaccines came out much quicker than most people expected. If the vaccines had taken another 6 months, we'd be in totally different territory.
Yeah. So, Kristian, coming to you now, we're at the end of the year. Can we now get some viral truths rather than viral myths? Do you think we can do this wheat chaff splitting a bit now? As I say, I appreciate that you can't necessarily do a league table of all countries in the world, but can we at least draw out what systems, what structures of government, what information processes, what speed of decision making, what political structures might have been fit for purpose in certain different areas, even if it's a mixed picture in each and every country?
Yes, I think you can. I think there are some clear success stories. It isn't just Taiwan. I mean, South Korea, even though they had this outbreak, in absolute terms, they would still be among the very, very best. Yeah. There are some countries that have just been good in health terms, but also in economic terms, and that didn't have severe restrictions of civil liberties, that had either no lockdown whatsoever or a short and limited, geographically limited one. So there are these, there are the Taiwans, the Hong Kongs, the South Korea, Singapore's. There are some success stories, but of course it only really tells us, as Chris said, how we should prepare or how we should react if another pandemic comes along, and even then only if that's a relatively similar virus. So it is an exercise of hindsight bias, clearly, but there is nonetheless a place for that, because the danger is that some people draw the wrong conclusions and that becomes a conventional wisdom. We've had this during the financial crisis, that a judgment quickly formed that this was all about the deregulation of the banking sector, the financial sector, and that is still with us now, 13 years later, and something like that could happen with the pandemic, that in 10 years' time you might still have people saying, oh no, we shouldn't ever cut government spending. Didn't we learn this in the pandemic of 2019, 2020?
Yeah. Chris, you're sort of saying, obviously, there's always a danger that you fight the last war, that, even if we are able to learn brilliant lessons, objective lessons from across the planet on this one, maybe the next big thing's, I don't know, cybersecurity threat or something like that. And we know how we tackle another coronavirus, but here is something completely different. But specifically on pandemic preparation, you've been pretty critical, at least about where the focus of British agencies were. You've continually said they had just one job and were actually more interested in things that I think you and I would call private health matters, lifestyle matters. What lessons can be drawn from the fitness for purpose for the agencies?
Well, I mean, that question is pretty much answered by what happened to Public Health England. It was smashed up, dissolved, and it was replaced by two organisations, one of which is essentially Nanny State England. The other is the much more important organisation, what is it called? UK, I can't remember what it's called, Health Security Agency, something like that.
Right.
Which is effectively a replacement of the original agency that Public Health England replaced. But they're entirely focused, and as Matt Hancock said, laser focused on infectious diseases and other threats of that kind. Genuine collective action problems, genuine public health threats, and the renamed Public Health England is going to carry on hectoring people about
jam,
smoking and alcohol and jam. Exactly, yeah. So we know which, I think it's implicit really that we know which of these two is more important now.
Yeah. Kristian, do you think that we'll be able to have a proper conversation about the NHS? What did your paper tell you about that? Did it indeed start to trigger a proper conversation, or did it show the impossibility of having one? That if you have the audacity to say that actually, the National Health Service might have a flaw or two here or there, let's keep a beady eye on it, that this is some form of treason?
Both were happening at the same time. I remember we were talking about this in the early stages of, certainly during the first lockdown, which is it going to be? Is this going to legitimize criticism of the NHS, or is it going to lead to a rally round the flag effect and the NHS becoming more sacrosanct than ever? I think both have happened. For the second effect probably outweighs the former. You have more people who are who are greater NHS patriots than ever, and those responses to the paper were an indication of that. But there has also been, in some circles, there is now a greater interest in talking about the faults, the flaws of the NHS. I did receive some sympathetic responses. It's not that every article about this was negative. There was, of course, quite a bit of hysteria, but there was also some interest in it, and you could see there is now a demand for alternative views on health systems. It's the minority, but it is a sizable minority. It's, I'd say, just about within the Overton window now.
Oh wow, well that's quite... So Chris, do you agree with that? Do you think our job at the IEA of raising these issues, which, your stuff on lifestyle economics, Kristian's done an awful lot on healthcare systems, is actually our task as a think tank going to be easier in the years to come? Are some spaces opening up in which we are no longer thinking the unthinkable and saying the unsayable, but we're actually part of a debate about change, a mainstream debate?
Yeah, increasingly so, and I think we've played our part in kind of at least articulating that case. But mainly, I think it's happening, and it will happen again in the future, is because the penny is starting to drop that we are spending a huge amount of money on the NHS. The claim that it's been underfunded, let alone chronically underfunded, it falls apart as soon as you look at the data. We're 13% of GDP now. Admittedly, GDP has crashed, but still it's going to be about 12% of GDP by the time we get through this. People are sick of not being able to see their GPs. People feel that the NHS is starting to now let us down, having, been applauded, literally applauded every Thursday on our doorstep. So I think there's, I think people are starting to ask themselves, why is this service that we pay so much for not as good as it could be? And we were a very long way for anybody saying we should be adopting what Kristian and we want to do in terms of having a more European system. But the question is being asked because the NHS is really so poor.
So that's the start. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for talking us through February. I need to ask each of you to rate your whole year out of 10, the calendar year of 2021. 0 is, the apocalypse did actually happen. 10 is, what a brilliant year. I mean, things couldn't really have gone better. Kristian, what's your integer between 0 and 10?
I'd say a 7. I mean, if we look at how we started and where we are now, it's a world of difference. It didn't look that way in the beginning. January, February, we're still miserable. we are now moving towards normality, and yes, there have been some setbacks at the moment, and maybe I will eat my words later. But no, given where we started from, there has been quite a lot of progress.
Chris, I've got a sneaky feeling you might pull down the average here. What's your number?
I mean, how can anyone give it more than a 2 or a 3? I mean, I'm not comparing it to how the year started. I'm comparing it to all the other years in my life.
Right,
and hopefully the
or
years
indeed in human
the future.
existence. Yeah.
And the 7 would be, I spent most of my life in misery. So no, it's going to be it was a bit better than 2020, I guess, so I'll give it a 2.
A 2?
Yeah.
A 2. A fairly upbeat 2 from Chris.
I think that's a fairly objective statement, to be honest with you.
And Chris, we've got to do the
Come
IEA
on.
Christmas cracker.
Come on.
Yes.
Fix.
Yes,
It's a Littlewood fix.
So can you get the special IEA Christmas cracker joke? Why did the economics professor stop telling his one joke?
Be here for ages. Just give us the answer.
There wasn't enough demand for it.
It's not too bad.
That's pretty bad. It's pretty bad.
Not many good economist jokes, to be fair.
Christian and Chris, thanks very much for working for us in 2021. Have a very, very Merry Christmas. Keep up the good work. Much done, much left to do. Thanks, gentlemen. Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.